How does it feel to go from pariah to powerful? Dr. J. Bhattacharya has lived that whiplash. He spent most of his life in the quiet, insular world of academic medicine until he rose to national infamy during the COVID pandemic when he co-authored the Great Barrington Declaration, a viral open letter signed by hundreds of public health experts denouncing lockdowns as an ineffective, unscientific catastrophe. Jay was roundly denounced as a crank. Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, called him a fringe epidemiologist. Then Jay took his job. He now runs the NIH, a $46 billion behemoth that's the engine of medical innovation in America. How does Jay think he can restore the public's trust?
I, as a scientist, should not get to decide whether I can do an experiment that puts the entire human population at existential risk. That there should be some other people having oversight over that, right?
What is the replication crisis, and why does it matter?
It's actually at the heart and soul of how we decide what's true and false about physical reality in our society.
And most importantly, can you please tell me if it's okay to keep using Zyn?
Do you use the nicotine pouch? I'm not a big fan of them, Rob.
Let's talk about that sense of whiplash, right? Again, a lot of people know you for your breakthrough, prescient, 100% vindicated work related to COVID policy, which I would say led to a lot of name calling and branding and marginalization, including from some of the institutions you're now responsible for. Not to get into too much, right? And then within a matter of months, you go from someone who was widely decried as running a death cult to running the NIH, a $46 billion operation, and like the essential source for basic scientific research in this country. Like, what was that like, man? How's it going?
I mean,
what's your stress level?
This is an absolutely crazy job. It's not a job I ever expected to have. And in fact, if a student were to ask me, Jay, how do I prepare to become the NIH director? What do I have to do? I don't have an answer for that question.
Yeah.
But it is. I do feel that I had been preparing for this job all my life in some ways, and the pandemic specifically, I think. The experience of being so public on such a vital issue, where it put me in contact with not always the most fun contact with some of the very, very prominent politicians, people high in the world of science. It was kind of an education in some ways that prepared me for this job.
Okay. Specifically, though, getting to, and you've talked about this on other platforms, rebuilding public trust in these institutions, right? I would say you don't need to editorialize if you don't want to, that there was a justified collapse in public trust in places like the NIH because of the way that the establishment engaged in some suboptimal ideological inflexibility during a once-in-a-generation pandemic, right? But I want to ask you, there's been this collapse, but there almost feels like an overcorrection in the other sense, where now people, their primary source of medical advice is whatever neurotropics Joe Rogan recommends, right? That's not great. There is such thing as medical expertise. There is such thing as objective scientific fact. How do you think about balancing those two things towards this mission of rebuilding trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, first, I completely agree with you about the failure of the scientific establishment during COVID. Right, the scientific establishment guaranteed there was no debate, made it so that you couldn't question whether the schools should close. I mean, I know that was a big issue for you, and it was a big issue for me as well. And so many people were still hurting as a result of those kinds of decisions, the vaccine mandates, the school closures, all that. And then just like petty things with like telling you that you have to put a mask on when you walk into a restaurant. When you sit down, you can take it off, and of course, COVID doesn't touch you because you're sitting down or something. I mean, that engendered a deep distrust in the scientific establishment. It's just a fact. But I also agree with you, Rob, that it is really important what science, like real science, honest science, can do. that can make your life better, that can help you make decisions for some difficult things in your life. It can, power medical treatments that actually make you better, and that are grounded in reality. And so my job, I think, is to try to figure out how to both acknowledge the harms and the lack of trust, the legitimate lack of trust, while also trying to help reform the institutions so we focus on the real good things and then set up guardrails so we never have what happened to us during the pandemic ever again.
Right. But I think it's interesting to get into the specifics. Like, what are specific things that might even sound a little bit wonky-ish, but that are concrete steps towards doing that?
Okay, so first, let me just take one big thing, actually, not a wonky detail. So I believe that it is possible that scientific research, sponsored in part by the NIH, but also lots of other entities, including the Chinese government, may have been the cause of the pandemic. There's a lot of people who just have fights over this. I'm not going to get too deep into the fights over this. But I will say is that the kinds of biological exercises people did in order to try to prevent a pandemic, go find viruses in weird bat caves, bring them into city centers, and then augment their capacity to infect humans. The reason why they did that was, I think, they were arguing that we needed to do that in order to prepare just in case a pandemic happens. But I think no matter what you believe about whether the cause of the pandemic was this kind of research, I think everyone can agree that kind of research is potentially very dangerous.
Right. And
another thing I think we can all agree is that the regulatory structure around that research was very poor before. And so the president issued a executive order a couple months back, essentially putting in place a regulatory structure, which I'm helping to develop, around that kind of research, where the idea is, I as a scientist should not get to decide whether I can do an experiment that puts the entire human population at existential risk. That there should be some other people having oversight over that, right? I mean, and this is, it's not even theoretical. Like, so, I mean, you can. Let's not fight over the pandemic. Let's just talk about the experiment that launched the nuclear age, right? Enrico Fermi, when he started that nuclear reaction on the squash court at the University of Chicago, of all places, he did a calculation. Would this nuclear chain reaction envelop the Earth? And luckily, he did that calculation and it was pretty close to zero before he did this.
Good to know.
We scientists owe the public that kind of calculation before we take any risk of that sort. And the public should have a say, right? That there should be the regulatory structure needs to take at its heart the idea that we're here working for the public and we don't take risks on without the public getting to say one way or the other. And that's what we're working on, is a regulatory structure that actually will, so we can tell the public honestly that we're not taking risks like that on your behalf.
And I promise this is the last relitigation of COVID. I promise, all right? But I do think there is still a sustained sense in which there has not been proper accountability for some profound miscalculations, right? In all the ways that some of the long tail research has come out and 95% vindicated you and the other leaders of your death cult, particularly as it relates to COVID case rates tied to severity of lockdowns, right? Stuff that you guys were very, very early on. That's fine for a couple professors to put out that book and show up on my favorite podcasts, but there has not yet been like a corresponding something remotely resembling like a mea culpa in which the public would see, okay, they are at least willing to take some accountability. But again, I understand, I'm sure, politically, policy-wise, you don't want to endlessly be relitigating the past. But it also doesn't feel like there has been proper accountability taken yet.
The thing is like people's lives are still affected, right? Kids whose schooling has been delayed for years, that may be permanent, where they have long-term effects, psychological harm, depression, drug abuse. All these things are lingering effects of the decisions made during the pandemic. And of course, the fact is that all of those measures, if you look at Sweden, they did better than we did. by far. They had actually almost no excess mortality through the entire pandemic. Right. It's incredible. The best in Europe, and they didn't do the lockdowns. So the question is like, what can we do to fix things, right? So as far, I think the constructive thing is, let's make plans for the next time that are more human, that take into account the lessons we learned. To me, the most important thing isn't, put people in jail or whatever. I don't think that'll fix things. Right. I think the most important thing is, if we have signals that there's viruses afloat, new viruses afloat, we have lots and lots of tools to try to understand them better, to address them, to develop countermeasures. All that biological stuff is great. We should keep doing some of that. Not all of it, but some of it. What we don't have is a social structure that responds to that information in a rational way. It's very clear that our societies are prone to panic. And when we panic, we sacrifice children, we sacrifice the poor, we sacrifice the working class. And so we have to structure our pandemic response plans to not ever do that again, because none of that helps protect anybody. And it causes tremendous lingering damage. That's the thing I think we're going to need to have as a society, an honest conversation. And I don't know, Rob, we're yet ready for, I very naively wrote an op-ed in 2021 in the Wall Street Journal, essentially calling for a COVID commission, saying we're ready for an honest discussion. That was like 4 years ago. And I don't think we have, now in retrospect, that was way too premature. We're starting to head into a moment, I think, where we can start to have that conversation, but we're maybe not quite yet there.
I think it's very hard for a lot of people to actually have to fully face the fact that much of the painful sacrifices they made were unnecessary. It's hard to know. It's hard to embrace the reality of something like that. Yeah. Let's move on to, how do you describe the replication crisis to the broader public in a way that makes it clear that this is a big deal?
Okay, so this is the thing about the replication. Whenever I start to talk about it, I think in my head, this is really boring. But it's not really boring. It's actually at the heart and soul of how we decide what's true and false about physical reality in our society. Right? So just very broadly, the scientific revolution happens when arbitrary authority, ecclesiastical authority, is overthrown. Its capacity to make truth is overthrown by ground reality. Galileo looking at the moons of Jupiter and saying the moons move, right? You don't get to gainsay that just because you have high authority. That's the base of the science. That's the major reason why the scientific revolution was such an important thing. It was an overthrowing of authority with ground truth. Yeah. What we had during the pandemic was the same kind of structure, but a different authority. High scientific authority decided it could say what is ground truth, even though the reality was very different, right? So with Tony Fauci famously saying, if you criticize me, you're criticizing science itself, right? That is indicative of a mindset that says, look, science is what the top authorities say it is. Mm-hmm. If you publish a paper in a top scientific journal, that's truth. If it's peer-reviewed, top scientific journal, that's truth. Actually, the scientific evidence says that's not correct. In fact, the replication crisis, which is now, people have been cognizant of it for at least 20, 30 years, 25 years, is an indicator that just because something is published in a top scientific journal does not mean, even though it's peer-reviewed, does not mean that it's true. And when independent people, try to do the studies of this, where they go back and try to repeat the experiments that were done, published in top scientific journals, half the time they find that doesn't repeat. You can get an indicator of this by the prevalence of scientific fraud at very high places. People at top universities, famous scientists, brought down from on high because they had a photoshopped gel in their paper or something. Yeah. The reason is because you get social benefits from publishing in top scientific journals. You get to decide what's true. But the fact is that people don't check that. The replication crisis is then is fundamentally an epistemological crisis, a crisis of how do we determine what's true and false in society. Wow. And the right way to determine what's true and false isn't the head director of the NIH says A, B, or C. I may be right, I may be wrong, who knows? Even if I publish in a top scientific journal, I might be wrong, I might be right, I may be wrong, who knows? It's independent people looking at the same question, often from different ways, find the same thing as me, over and over and over again. That's how we determine truth in science. And the replication crisis then has its solution in changes in the incentives of science. You don't get advances in your career just by publishing in top scientific journals. You get advances in your career by doing things, identifying things that turn out to be true, by other people checking them. That's how you. I think so. There's a whole sociology of science involved here, but really fundamentally, it's a fundamental inversion akin to what happened during the scientific revolution of the 16th century, 17th century to today. We have to restore ground reality as the basis for truth making in society rather than authority.
So I just want to put a point on this. You're saying of the published results in established medical journals, right? The gods on high telling us this is an accurate picture of reality. Fully half the time, when someone else tries to replicate their experiment to get the same results, it fails.
Yeah, I mean, there's different estimates of this, but yeah, something on that order. I mean, I can give you a concrete manifestation of this that everyone will recognize, right? So when I was a kid in the 70s and then into the 80s, my family was scared to death of eggs because they'd read my dad was diabetic, and they'd read this literature that all the advice was based on this literature that scientific literature that eggs have cholesterol, which then cause heart attacks. Absolutely scared to death of eggs. Didn't eat an egg until I was in my teens. Then all of a sudden, egg whites were okay. So we'd have these horrible egg white omelets, which were great because I never had an egg before. What did I know? Yeah. And now eggs are superfood.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can say, and it wouldn't be unreasonable for you to say, well, the science changed, Jay. We discovered new things. That's true, we did. The question, though, is why were we so confident that eggs were bad for you? It's because the replication of that result didn't happen. It was relatively powerful people within the scientific community who dominated the conversation got to say what was true and what was false. And it was conveyed to the public with the utmost confidence that this is ground reality, this is truth. If it's ground truth and ground reality, then how can it change over and over and over again?
Yeah.
When I was a medical student, I had one of my favorite professors would tell me that, Jay, half of what we're teaching you is not true. And of course, my reaction was like, well, which half? And he was right. Like, so for instance, when I was a medical student, I'm ancient. Back then, we didn't know that bacteria causes ulcers. So people would do surgeries to cut your vagus nerve off to treat stomach ulcers. There were like item after item after item where, as doctors, we were 100% confident something was true, and it turns out the opposite was true. Again, over and over and over and over again. And what that points to, the fraud, the scientific fraud, these studies of replication, this sort of reversal of like basic things, which again, we saw that during COVID in spades, is that our engine for deciding what is true and false in science is broken.
What specifically can the NIH do about this?
That's the beautiful thing about the NIH. Like, we have tremendous culture-making power. I think the reason why replication crisis exists is because, one, you can't make a career out of scientific replication. It's very hard to do that anyways. Like, you try to get your work published in a top journal, and they'll tell you, well, this is just a replication. It's already been done. There's nothing new here. Of course, there's something new here. An independent team finds the same answer. That's a new thing, right?
Right.
We got to fix that. You have to be able to allow people to do, independent people to like make a career, a successful scientific career out of doing replication work, honestly, creatively.
Yeah.
Second, we have to have a place where you can publish it for that to happen, right? So if I write a paper that's just a replication effort of somebody else's science, I'm going to have a hard time publishing it anywhere. People are going to have a hard time. Well, they won't even know it exists because it doesn't not rewarded. And then third, we have to. Okay, right now, suppose you have some famous scientific result, Rob, right? So you published a great paper, had a great idea, and then I approach you as another independent scientist, say, Rob, I'd like to replicate your result. Please share your data with me. You're going to view me as a threat to your career.
Yeah.
Right? Because what if I prove you wrong? But the reality is, I'm not a threat. The fact that you had an idea that's important enough to warrant replication is an indicator that you're a good scientist. That in fact, being approached for replication is a mark of honor. It's not a bad thing to have a result that's not replicated. Science is hard. It's okay if you honestly got it wrong. There's no problem in that. In the VC world in Silicon Valley, they understand this. They allow failure to happen without excessive punishment, right? Whereas in science, we just say, well, one failure and you're out.
Yeah.
And the replication crisis is related to that. We have to sort of flip the culture of science around to say, if you're approached for replication, if you share your data with others, you're a good scientist. That's a marker of a good scientist, whether the result is replicated or not. Right? Now, fraud's a different thing. But fraud goes away if you do replication, by the way. If the ground truth is what determines what your elevation in scientific society rather than just authority, then you're not gonna want to commit fraud. If you publish a paper in a top journal with fraudulent results, you're not going to get any credit for it because it won't replicate. So what the NIH can do is we can start to reward scientists with large grants that allow them to do replication. Independent scientists, make it into a prominent career, just like you're mentioning about I think it was your mother that had got her scientific career because she had NIH grants. Let's start giving NIH grants to scientists who do replication work creatively, and then the universities will promote them. It'll start to become an honorable part of our profession. Then we can put a journal together where we allow people to publish their replication results, their falsification exercises, their meta-analyses. And then every time you search for a paper, there can be a button that the NIH can create next to it, where you click it and say, what does the replication result say? All the AI can summarize all the replication results. So you can tell at a click whether a scientific result has that kind of replication support or not.
Right.
And then third, we can, just like in baseball, like you have all these like stats, right? But imagine if you only measured stolen bases but not caught stealings. You get too many slow runners trying to steal second base, right?
Right.
Because you never get punished for being caught. We need to have a fuller set of metrics measuring the productivity of scientists. Right now, the only metrics we really have are metrics of volume, how many papers you published, and how much influence you have, how many citations you have. It's like trying to measure how good a baseball player is by measuring stolen bases alone. You want a fuller set of measures. You want, how many home runs do they hit, how many strikeouts do they have, how many caught stealings do they have. I mean, your full set of metrics that gives you the quality of the baseball, like the productivity of the baseball player among many different dimensions. We need a broader set of metrics for scientists too. So, do you try out new ideas in your work often, even if they fail? That's a good thing for a scientist, right? Do you cooperate with others in pro-social ways by sharing your data, sharing your code, sharing your research materials? Do you write your papers in a way so that it's very easily replicated, right? So because with detailed steps so that anyone can look and say, okay, here, if I do this, this, and this, I should expect that. We can make metrics around all of that. Does your work translate over into patents? Does it translate over into better treatments for people? Does it change fundamental knowledge of how biology works? All of those are like things that in principle we can measure. And if we measure it, people will aim toward it. It won't just be influence and volume.
And the idea is the NIH, its primary lever for modifying this incentive structure is that it is such a key source of money for scientific
$50 billion
research.
a year. Yeah, that's
right.
it.
It's like you do actually have the lever and the power and the leverage in order to shift these incentives. If anybody can do it, it's going to be this institution.
Yes, correct.
I'm going to purposely ask you this in the most minimalist way possible, right? Which is, that actually is a good segue into the completely non-controversial issue of child health care, right? And vaccines, right? Actually, let's just leave it at that. Let's leave it at that. That's an issue. It's definitely part of this broader collapse in public trust. I think you've done a very good job of taking a middle ground on an issue that tends to be maximally divisive.
They'll get beat up by both sides.
Yeah, exactly. How is it that that analysis related to replication crisis can maybe shed some light and rebuild trust on something that hot button?
Okay, so first, really fast, just to get this out of the way, child health is more than just vaccines.
Right.
It's about, and so I think we should be thinking about child health pretty broadly. But let's just go back to vaccines in particular, right? So the collapse in trust in science, the consequence of it is that the strategies that public health has used to give confidence to parents about vaccines, it's not, for some chunk of the public, it'll no longer work. You can't just be, my pediatrician says so, and therefore it should do it. Or the CDC says so, and we're going to do it. Like the chunk of the public who lost trust in public health during the pandemic will never respond to that kind of approach.
Right. It can't be more divine dictates if you actually care about rebuilding trust.
Right. So it has to be then honest engagement with what we know and what we don't know. Absolute honest engagement, even if it is uncomfortable for folks who think that, like me, who think that vaccines are actually a really important tool for public health, improving child health. I have to be able to say to somebody who's asking me, well, here's where the evidence is, and here's the replication studies that support that evidence. Here's where the here's what I don't know, and here's what here's my best advice given what I know and what I don't know. I'm not saying that I know for certain it's safe and effective. Just repeating that mantra isn't enough. I have to say, look, 99.9% of the time, the measles vaccine is well tolerated. There's some indicator of some side effects. Here's what the evidence says for that in some fraction of the population. It's really hard to predict if your child will be one of those or not. But I also know here's what happens if your child gets measles. And look, here's the evidence that the measles vaccine prevents your child from getting measles for their entire life. Right. And you present it that way, in an honest way, saying, look, here's the benefits and harms, without any coercion, in a way that's consistent with informed consent rights. I think ultimately you'll get much more trust and much more uptake of the vaccines that really are excellent are necessary for child health than if you do it the other way of trying to coerce people into taking something, push them, put mandates in place, essentially look down on them, pretend as if they can't understand scientific reality.
Right.
I can give you evidence of this. Right. So if you look in Scandinavia, particularly in Sweden, you have incredibly high uptake of the childhood vaccines. The schedule is more limited than our schedule, but certainly it's still an extensive schedule with the measles vaccine, MMR vaccine, DPT, a whole host of vaccines. You have very high uptake of those vaccines, but you have no coercion. There's no mandates. There's no pressure. There's just a scientific public health establishment that has the trust of the people. That's honest. Like in Sweden, for instance, in 2009, I guess, was the H1N1 flu epidemic. There was a flu vaccine that was used there that caused narcolepsy in a bunch of kids, and the Swedish public health establishment owned up to it, said this was our mistake, and they changed their policies around how to evaluate the approval of new vaccines, taking that lesson into account. That kind of honest engagement of confessing mistakes, that's how you rebuild trust in vaccines and in everything else.
Right, because we just saw the inverse of this, right? And essentially with the COVID vaccine, which when it was first invented, it was an incredible medical innovation, but the people that were in charge then went way out ahead of what the evidence indicated and wildly overpromised what it does, right? It doesn't stop transmission, it doesn't stop infection. And then there was a systematic, oftentimes coordinated silencing of people that even, like you, had good faith critiques of the overstatement. But then that means what gets lost, as far as I can tell, the data is pretty definitive that uptake in the vaccine for the first 6 or 9 months after it was released did actually drive down mortality among high-risk populations, right? Yeah. And if you just suppress anything relating to the nuance or overstate what you actually know, you create this space for skepticism and conspiracy theorizing.
Yeah,
right?
so it's right. I mean, why was it mandated for young men? Why is the COVID vaccine, when we knew relatively early on that it causes myocarditis at some rate? We can argue about the rate. Makes no sense. Like when we knew, again, relatively early on that it didn't stop you from getting or spreading COVID, why were we telling people that as if that we should act as if it does?
Right.
Right. It was very frustrating. Because I was reading the scientific evidence saying that things like this, and that's what the scientific evidence was saying. And yet, if you said those things in public, you were cast as an anti-vaxxer. It's not anti-vax to say, here's what the scientific evidence says. Here's the situations when it's beneficial to use this vaccine. Here's the situations when it's less likely beneficial. Here's what we know and here's what we don't know, right? I advocated during the pandemic for older people to take the vaccine. I didn't advocate to force older people to take it. I was actually relieved when my mom took the vaccine in March of 2021. For me personally, I took it, but I was indifferent. In my analysis at the time, I was like of an age. I was like 50 at the time, 51 at the time. I was an age where, like, if you were a bit older than me, you probably should take it. If you were younger than me, you probably shouldn't. And I was right in the cusp. I was like, okay, I'm indifferent. Yeah. And I knew that there were possibly going to be side effects. I didn't know because the randomized trial only ran for 2 months, right? So there's some uncertainty in that decision. And so when I would tell people about this, I would say, if you're older, on balance, it's probably good. I can't guarantee there won't be side effects. If you're younger, in fact, I wrote an op-ed in April with Martin Kulldorff in April 2021 recommending the kids not get the vaccine, not get the COVID vaccine, because it didn't make sense because the COVID risk was harm from COVID. The risk of dying from getting COVID was so low. And the vaccine, if this main job was to reduce the risk of death, well, it was already very low in kids. And there were possible side effects.
Right.
That kind of nuance, I don't have no idea why public health people think the public won't understand that.
Yeah, it sounds like they just assume that they wouldn't, or that they would just misuse it, right? On the equally seemingly not interesting topic that actually is deeply important of how much of our medical establishment devotes resources and money after people have gotten sick and debilitated and have disease versus how much of that money is put towards preventing the development of disease in the first place. There's the question of what's your larger framework for thinking about this? How much of that problem is larger structural forces where you can kind of adjust and tinker on the edges so people aren't as likely to get sick? And how much of it does boil down to individual responsibility and making better choices towards preventing the development of disease? The framework, and then within that framework, what exactly can the NIH do?
Yeah, so that essentially is the MAHA movement in a nutshell. Our society is chronically ill at levels that are ridiculously high, right? We haven't had an increase in life expectancy since 2012 in this country. Right. And so we are at a crisis. The cause of those crises very broadly are both structural and also because our medical care system is not oriented toward prevention in a way it might be useful to be. And so the MAHA movement is to try to mobilize the various organs of public health, including the NIH, to address this problem. Some of it will involve individual choices to make, but those individual choices need to be sort of supported by great science, changes in our social structures that uselessly, harmfully encourage bad outcomes. Like, I'll give you one example, right? So the idea that folks who are on food stamps, SNAP, shouldn't be able to use that money to buy junk food was weirdly controversial before the Maha movement.
Yeah.
Our structures, our society should make it easier to be healthy, not harder. So you need great science, you need changes in structures, and then you also need individuals to decide and be supported in the deciding that they're going to work toward their better health.
Right. Okay, last question. Last question that we'll probably have to cut, but I have to ask you anyway. So, your friend and old college roommate, Peter Thiel, has called nicotine the perfect neuroenhancer. Or at least that's what I remember him saying to justify my current usage of Zyn. Can you please confirm for me that nicotine pouches are risk-free cognitive enhancers and I'm under no obligation to reduce my use of them?
You should reduce your use of nicotine pouch. I'm not a big fan of them, Rob. Did Peter really say that? That's crazy.
He says something like that. At least that's how I remember.
That's not, crazy is the wrong word. Peter's a very interesting man, but on this, I'm pretty sure he's wrong.
Well, for someone like him, you have to constantly be going against the orthodoxy, and it would make sense that the hit rate is not 100%. Sometimes you take down Gawker, sometimes you help elect Trump, but sometimes maybe you're wrong.
I first met Peter in my college dorm, and he was very good at chess, but my roommate was better at chess. And so he was in the room playing against my roommate this 5-minute matches where Peter had 30 seconds and my friend had 5 minutes, and Peter lost every time. Peter had 5 minutes, my friend had 30 seconds.
Yeah.
And Peter lost every time. It was so I know he's not infallible.
All right, you have to go. Thank you for giving us all this time. It's awesome to see you on this campus. It's really cool.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah.
Nice to have you here.